Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stuart MacDonald. I'm the editor of Inside Housing magazine. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar debate on commercialisation in housing. We're running this in association with Service Matters, which is a division of Orbit Housing Group. We've got a fantastic panel here today to help us debate and discuss these issues, and really getting into the issue about how best social landlords can diversify their income streams. Whether you're considering opening up your contact centre to other businesses or launching into the private rented sector or even commercial property, our panel has either done it or has worked with those who have, and they're very eager to share their knowledge and tips with everybody today. Now, first up, we're going to hear from Matthew Bales, who's the Director of Regulation at the Homes and Communities Agency. Matthew and his team at the HCA have been consulting with the sector at length with regard to how best to regulate social housing providers as they try to diversify and grow their income streams. This process is not yet complete, but Matthew is going to outline today where the HCA is currently at in its thinking and why it's at where it's at. Then we're going to hear from Afzal Ismail, who's the Executive Director, and Julian Beanie, who's the Business Services Director of both at Service Matters, which is a division of Orbit Group. Orbit's got a decade of experience in selling its services to other organisations, and Afzal and Julian are going to share their experience of how Service Matters decided which sectors to target and how it won its contracts and the hurdles it cleared on the way. And last but by no means least, we're going to hear from Victoria Jardine, who's a partner at Anthony Collins Solicitors. Victoria works with a variety of social landlords on how they commercialise their businesses, and I think it's fair to say what she doesn't know about charity and regulatory rules is not really worth knowing. So before I hand over to our first speaker, Matthew Bales, I just wanted to briefly set the scene a little further and say a wee bit about how to get the most out of the webinar today. Social landlords are seeing their traditional incomes squeezed in terms of rents and grant funding for development. We all know they're being encouraged by government to diversify their businesses, to find new sources of income in order to fund more house building. However, by nature, this involves taking on increased levels of hopefully calculated risk. Yet at the same time, the regulator, the Homes and Communities Agency, is picking up the pieces in the aftermath of, I think it's fair to say, was a debacle with Cosmopolitan-Style Group after the Liverpool-based landlord nearly went bust, taking on liabilities in its student housing business, which it simply didn't fully understand. As a result, the HCA and social landlords are trying to pick a path through this which protects their existing social housing businesses while taking on the additional risks which will result in increased revenues. Now, it's fair to say this is a pretty tricky balancing act, and it's one about which we're going to hear more shortly in terms of how landlords and the regulator are managing this. Now, just a very quick word about webinars. I know many of you will have attended a webinar before, but just if you could bear with me for a minute, for those of you who have not, that would be great. This works pretty much like any other face-to-face seminar you might have been to. We're going to hear from each panellist for 7 minutes. Then there will be plenty of time for debate and questions before we finish at 1 p.m. To ask a question, you need to use the question box I'm indicating on your screens just now with a lovely neon pink arrow. You can hear us on the panel, but we can't hear you as attendees, so please don't try to shout any questions out. I will do my best to make sure we get through as many of the questions as we can. Your question that you type in the Q&A box can only be seen by the panelists until it is answered, and then it can be seen by everybody else. You can post a question at any time during the session. As I say, I'll do my best to get through all of them, but the panelists are also able to answer questions by typing a response at any time, and I've encouraged them to do this wherever possible. At the end of the session, you will be able, as attendees, to download the presentations as well as the transcript of the Q&A box. So it would be great if you were able to take a minute to complete the feedback form on that you receive on your emails, just to make sure we aren't any problems for next time. Right, okay. I think it's sensible now to get cracking and hand over to our first speaker, who is Matthew Bales from the HCA. Okay, Matthew, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very quickly going to run through our view of the sector as a whole and then get into the issues that Stuart described around our interest in diversification and what, as a regulator, we would like to see.
Why is this not moving?
Stuart, sorry, we're just having a bit of a problem moving the slides on, which is probably not very convenient for folk at home or in the office.
Yeah, just bear with me 2 seconds, Matthew. Sorry, the screen is just frozen. 2 minutes, everybody. Apologies.
Stuart, am I good to go?
Yeah, apologies, Matthew. I'm just going to reload this. I think that's going to be the best thing to do. Just bear with me 2 seconds. Apologies, everybody. Matthew, do you want to try again and see if that's going to move?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. No, I'm afraid the slides are still stuck, Stuart. Let's try.
Okay, Matthew, we'll just move it through from here. It's going to be the easiest thing to do if you just want to carry on with the presentation. Thanks.
Okay, good afternoon. Sorry about that. I'm very briefly going to talk about our view of the sector as a whole and then move on to our particular view on diversification away from social housing activities. The first substantive slide breaks down the sector's global accounts position in terms of income and expenditure. I'm not going to dwell on this particularly, but you'll see, or at least I hope you'll see, if the slides are going to move on, which they're not, but okay, can we go to the next one, please? You'll see at the bottom of the spreadsheet that the surplus in the sector has moved on quite substantially over the last 4 years. Last recorded surplus about 1.8 billion. A few things happening there. Providers squeezing costs, large-scale voluntary transfer associations increasingly moving into surplus. There's also some cyclical things in there, if you like, so interest rates being low reduces the cost of debt, and there's been an uptick in sales as well. So a very positive position, but not one a position from which we should be complacent. Similarly, on the balance sheet position of providers, we can move to the next slide. A growing and healthy balance sheet. Our general view as a regulator is that the sector is in good financial health and withstood the pressures of the credit crunch remarkably well. However, we are in a post-credit crunch world. If we move to the next slide, and it's a very different world. Something that we've captured in our second sector risk profile, which was published last week, which I would recommend to to those of you in the sector to have a good look at. 3 or 4 things that sort of fundamentally changed since the credit crunch. Welfare reform, I'm sure you're familiar with, and its many guises. So the so-called bedroom tax, the overall cap on welfare payments for families in due course, a universal credit and direct payment of benefits to tenants. I think it's as yet unclear exactly what the impact of those changes will be, but certainly there's a risk to landlords' income, and we'd certainly expect landlords now to be managing that risk actively. Some other quite important changes, some very different position in terms of grant. A new rent settlement from 2015, which gives the sector a good deal of surety, I think, for the next now 12, 13 years, albeit some issues for some who have not yet reached target rents. And something that we saw before the credit crunch and remains an issue is the sector's exposure to sales, traditionally shared ownership sales, but increasingly sales of open market properties. Now, I think that in summary what's happened is that since the credit crunch, the change in government funding, revenue and capital has meant that, in essence, providers don't have the sort of no-brainer option of just building affordable homes with government grant, and are increasingly looking at other opportunities. And in a sense, that's what we're here to discuss today. So what's the regulator's interest? Well, we are a social housing regulator, and it's certainly not our job, and we haven't got the statutory powers to direct providers on what exactly they should do, nor would we want to. But we do have obligations to protect tenants and taxpayers and to support the supply of social housing. In essence, our view is that we should focus on protecting the social housing assets, which does three very important things. It protects the taxpayer investment in those assets, it protects the tenants who live in those homes, and it also sets the preconditions for attracting investment into the sector so that the homes that we need can be financed in future. Now, in this context, our focus is on the social housing business and the social housing assets. Our interest in diversification lies in the relationship. Put another way, what impact could diverse activities have on the social housing business, good or bad? If we move on to the next slide, what do we want to see? Well, in essence, the regulatory settlement involves us setting standards, economic standards on governance, viability, value for money and rents. And our interest as a regulator is ongoing compliance with those standards, particularly in this context, the viability standard. So it's certainly not our place to say to providers don't diversify, but I think it is our place to say diversify in a way that does not risk your social housing assets. Various ways that one might do that. Limited recourse means in the event that things go wrong, the extent to which the social housing business is exposed to the risks taken on is limited. As Stuart mentioned, the Cosmopolitan case, in that case, the social housing business was exposed to the risks of a student subsidiary, and that was at the heart of many of the problems with that association. We expect to see a board that really understands the opportunity and the risks of taking on new commercial activities. And we certainly want to see, and I'm sure Victoria will talk about this, people understanding their charitable vagaries, and partly for that reason, but partly by way of good risk management, pricing risk appropriately. So put another way, we'd expect people, if in the rest of the market people are pricing risk at, say, 10% return of entering into the private rented sector, then it would be odd if registered providers didn't take a similar view on the risks and price that in accordingly. Now, in terms of where we're going, I think that summarises broadly where we are. Where we're going has been the subject of quite a lot of debate. So the next slide sort of summarises the position as understood here. As Stuart said, we published a discussion document which outlined our thinking on this, and in essence it said we've got a responsibility to protect the social housing assets. Commercial activity is not wrong, but it's perhaps potentially different to social housing businesses. For example, social housing is an oversubscribed product. It's a product that's still largely underwritten by housing benefit. It's a product where the value of the asset, if it's vacant, is usually worth a good deal more than its current form. So social housing businesses, ought to run smoothly, and they ought not to get into viability problems. That's not so true of some commercial activities, and a good question to ask always is, if this is going to make money, why are other people not doing it already? So social housing, low risk business, very important that we protect the assets. Other businesses may be slightly different in terms of their risk profile. We set out that problem, we came up with some possible ways of addressing it, at the heart of which was a proposition around ring fencing, which is essentially isolating risk. So in this context, limiting the extent to which the commercial bit of a business could bring down or adversely affect the social housing bit of the business. I think we got a strong response to that. It confirmed what we knew already. I think that ring fencing would be complex for the sector in its current form, and it also made us think about whether ring fencing was always the right way of protecting the social housing assets. And we reached the conclusion that although ring fencing might be a useful tool for providers, it may not be the only tool, and there was a risk in of using ring fencing, particularly if providers, frankly, didn't do it properly, that they would take on more risk, and ultimately those risks would come back onto the social housing balance sheet and actually make the situation worse. So we've moved on in terms of our thinking. 3 or 4 crucial points. Firstly, the regulation committee is absolutely determined to protect the assets. That hasn't changed. Secondly, risk is not wrong. If no one took any risks, we wouldn't build any homes. So the issue is about the appropriate level of risk and the extent to which that can affect the social housing business. There's a very basic point about understanding the level of recourse and the position on assets and liabilities more generally. So in future, I'm sure we're going to expect providers to have a more detailed grip on who's the assets they own, who's got recourse to what, the liabilities they've taken on. And then I think instead of asking most providers to ring fence, we will ask them to stress test their businesses. And what we mean by that is not the sort of sensitivity analysis that most businesses do already, but asking yourself the question, perhaps over a 20, 30, 40-year period, what sorts of things can go very badly wrong? And if you look back, for example, in the recent past, there have been spikes in interest rates and steep reductions in house prices over that sort of period. In that kind of scenario, can the social housing business survive? Can the assets be protected? It's the kind of question that we're going to expect boards to ask and answer, and we will seek assurance that the business, if you like, is well prepared to weather any future storms such that the assets are protected. In terms of next steps, as the slide says, we'll continue the conversation with our stakeholders over the autumn rather. We're likely to publish a consultation document relatively early in the new year outlining changes to our standards. Okay, that's it from me. I think I'm handing over to Julian and Afsal.
That's fine, Matthew. Thank you very much for that. Apologies for the initial problems. Okay. I think Afsal, you were going to take the first part of the presentation, so I'll let's see if you can click that through yourself.
Okay.
I'll pass you. I'm going to try that now. If it's not working for you, we can put it back to my colleague.
Okay. Thanks, Stuart. Hello, everyone. As Stuart said, Julian and I will cover the next bit around service matters and our experience at Orbit. And what I want to explore is, given the subject matter of this webinar, commercialization in housing, what do we mean by commercialization? One or two drivers of commercialization, and then Julian will talk to you in a bit of detail around our particular experience around setting up service matters, which is, as Stuart said, a division within Orbit. So in terms of commercialization, what do we mean? I think it's been sort of well documented that there is pressure on not only in this sector, but all sectors at the moment, and organizations, not least housing associations, have to do more for less. Public capital funding, public subsidy is decreasing. Who knows what will happen with our revenue funding. So it's important that we think about commercial activities and having the ability to bring other income in from other sources. Stuart, I've lost the ability to move my slides.
Okay, I'll pass that back to my colleague, and we'll do it from here after. If you just want to say when
Yeah.
you want to move, that would be fine.
Yeah, we could move on to the first slide. Okay, thank you. So in terms of my first slide, so what does the word commercial mean for us based on our experience? Well, commercial for us means, yes, we need to generate income, and I think we talk a lot about that. But in terms of our mindset, it's also about looking at what efficiencies we can make, what other resources we can create within the business itself. So not only is it about increasing our income from a number of sources, it's also about the efficiencies that we can make within the business. So it is about mindset, and we all know the number of areas that housing associations certainly are getting into, not least some of those examples that I've got over there on the slide around sales of homes, market sales, sales of voids to support our affordable program. Some organizations are selling their DLO, the repair service, to other housing associations. And certainly within Orbit, we're into selling our professional corporate services to a number of organizations. But on the other side of the coin is the efficiency, as I said. You know, what are we doing around better procurement? What are we doing around looking at our systems and our processes and taking out waste? And that will create additional resource. And also innovation is very important. We know that the private sector, particularly the successful ones, are very much into innovation and want to innovate to increase and maximize their bottom line. So as I said, it is about a mindset in a lot of respects. So moving on, there is some new language creeping into the sector. And one of the words that we hear a lot more now is the word profit. And again, for Orbit, what profit means is profit for a purpose, not to redistribute to shareholders, but certainly profit for a purpose, and that purpose is to reinvest in our social purpose. But also alongside the word profit is the word risk, and Matthew mentioned this a few moments ago, and that's a very, very important word. Yes, we need to diversify, but as Matthew alluded to, do we understand the risks we're entering? Has the exec got the skills and the experiences? Has the board got the skills and experiences so that, you know, they're aware and guard themselves from the likes of the incidences that we've had, like Cosmopolitan? So it's really important that we are in the new world of risk. We're used to managing risk previously, but as Matthew said, it is a new world, and we need to make sure that we are geared up to understanding the new risk environment, particularly the risks associated with whatever activities we are diversifying in. So governance and oversight is extremely important, and therefore the relationship between the execs and the board becomes even more important around understanding the new risk world we're in. So, you know, the culture of the organization, which is very important, and the people that you have within the organization is very, very important as well. And so new language is creeping in, and as I said, commercial is about making sure that we have the mindset, we have the people, and we create the culture which enables us to take risks, but take calculated risk where we understand what the risk is, and we understand the consequences and are prepared for the consequences. Moving on to the next slide. So what does commercial mean to you? Is it at the detriment of a customer service? If you see those two pictures, top left is around some of the low budget airlines where they forget about customer service, whereas the bottom right hand corner with John Lewis, whatever your perception of John Lewis is, the general perception is that it is a good to great organization which thinks about the customer, but also is focused on the bottom line and is an ethics-based business. So, you know, for us, commercial is very much about a values-based ethical business, and when we do business with others, and we put our values first and foremost at the front of everything that we do. So it's really important that you understand what commercial means to you, what it means to the organization, and you take steps to make sure that you have the right people in place. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of our definition, the definition that we're using within the business around commercial, it is the one that you see on your screen, and that's one that we are actively using within the business. As I said, values-based ethical business generating profit for a purpose. We're completely focused on value for money and understanding our cost of our services. So it is the same side. It is the two sides of the same coin, where on one hand we are driven and looking to bring income actively into the business and generating a net profit, but also on the other side is understanding our cost base, making sure that we take waste out of our systems and processes, and very much driven with the customer in mind, not only the business-to-business customers, but certainly our residents, our tenants, and our leaseholders. So our commercial is commercial mindset. Yes, we've diversified and we do bring income in, but commercial is a mindset within Orbit where we think around both sides, income and efficiency. And certainly the disciplined approach, I think for me, refers to the risk-taking. Know your risk, know what you're getting into, make sure you have the right people around the table, both at the exec board level and certainly people who work within your business. Thank you. Julian?
Right, hello, my name's Julian Beanie, and I'm going to take on the next set of slides and give you kind of a practical insight. Just checking, I think I can control it, Stuart. What we've done at Orbit, and this has been happening for over 10 years, is actually take an opportunity to sell out our corporate and professional services, you can see there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through some of the things we've learned from it, and also some of the benefits that we've brought in as well. Having said that, Stuart, it's just, could you move on to the next slide, please? Could somebody do that? Thank you. So how have we done it? Now, interesting, when I put these slides together, and we actually were speaking to another group last week about this, the absolute parallels to any service. So it's a sort of statement of the blinding obvious, really, but what I've got on there are the kind of approaches you need for any kind of commercial activity, not just about selling professional services, but even some of the property things that obviously some of you are considering as well. I've had the opportunity to work outside the housing sector more recently, and I think the absolute focus has got to be on the customer, and I suppose this is taking understanding the customer to a new level, because when you're selling services and acting in a commercial way, really what we're talking about is asking customers to part with cash for whatever the services we're looking to provide. And what we've had to do is really make sure that we understand our customers, and then we focus our products and services to what they want, not how we want to deliver them. And that is a mindset change, and you'll see some of the positives around that in a minute. One of the challenges about working for a larger organization is actually trying to understand your costs. And this moves beyond just what's in your budget, but actually trying to get into the murkier parts of corporate overheads and things such as that. And this is crucial, and I think this picks up from the managing the risk point of view, because we need to make sure that the commercial activity is standing on its own 2 feet, that it bears its share of the corporate overhead charge, so that when it's talking about generating profit, that it is actually a true reflection of the services it's providing. Like any organization, a commercial organization has to have slick internal processes, but even more focused really, particularly when you're talking about making sure that the money you generate gets into the business, because certainly our experience at Orbit has been it's an organization set up to bring in millions of pounds of rental income. Actually generating invoices for services is actually a sort of a different way of thinking. So making sure that finance systems are right up to date. The next one is pretty much a statement of the obvious, but it is making that customer journey as seamless end to end. Just want to talk a little bit about marketing and sales, really, because these words are used quite a lot in the housing business, marketing and sales. Many people have those in their title. What we found is it's looking at marketing from a lead generation and sales point of view. So not really just about PR and communications and getting your brand out there, which is typically what is done in many parts of a housing organisation, but generating leads in a business-to-business context. And that brings in great opportunities as well, and great new into the business. what is interested is trying, what we did was say, well, we've got some great internal services, other people, we can sell those to other people. Actually, what you need to do as part of that is turn internal members of staff into great salespeople. And we know when we use the word salespeople, people kind of immediately shudder. So what we've actually adopted is a trusted advisor sales strategy, which is essentially about humanizing sales, and people actually develop relationships, and from those get kind of profitable relationships. Okay, let's move into the next slide, please. The lessons learned, and I'm not going to dwell too much on those because I think they're an extension of what I've just said, and actually say what they need to. But it's bringing in a new way of thinking. Now, actually having some expertise of people that have done this in the business-to-business context is very powerful, because we all know people that say that I've done it before, it is possible, actually helps to change that mindset. But certainly rethinking the business in the business-to-business context and bringing those skills in is very crucial. So just because it's conscious of time, moving on to the next slide, please. On the next slide, you'll see 3 points on there, and what's on there is really what has Service Matters and its commercial approach brought to orbit. Thank you. Three main points really. We kind of wax lyrical about this, but firstly, it gives Orbit the economies of scale. That it means that we can reduce the internal cost to other parts of the business. So scale does bring those benefits. Secondly, as Asa mentioned, thinking commercially means that we can have, and having the scale brings in those high caliber senior staff that mean we can drive forward that innovation and thought leadership across the business, and that means that we're able to take forward innovative thinking that help all other parts of Orbit. The last point really is that actually if we get our costs right, we price competitively, we manage the risks, then this is generating profitable income with minimal risk and no additional cost to Orbit. And actually, that at the end of it is that helps to build some more homes and then deal with some community engagement, then that's really what it is about. If you just move to the next slide, really, this just gives you a flavour of some of the things that we do. Very happy to share our thoughts with you and share our story with you, and be happy to speak at a later date. Thank you.
Okay, Julian and Afsal, thank you both very much. And we're going to move on to our third speaker now, Victoria Jardine, who's a partner at Anthony Collins Solicitors. Victoria, I think we'll just keep hold of the slides here. If you just want to say when you want to move forward, we'll just do that. It's probably going to be the easiest thing to do. Over to you.
That's fine, Stuart. Thanks very much. It's been extremely interesting hearing what the other speakers have been saying this morning. And my experience is in advising RPs on how they go about structuring diversified activities. And if we move to the first slide, please, Stuart. RPs often find themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place when it's looking towards the future. You've got the definition of regulatory success, which is, as Matthew's explained, all around the protection of social housing assets from risk. But you've got to then deliver your diversified social activities in an environment of low grant rates. It's increasingly difficult to cross-subsidise those activities. So the cherry of commercial diversification is very enticing, and the opportunity to make lots of money is something that obviously everybody wants to get on the bandwagon. Really, RPs want to find a sweet spot between the two, which is a safe middle ground where you can identify and manage the risks of any commercial activities that you carry out, so that you're quite sure that you're achieving an appropriate return on those activities, whilst at the same time balancing this against any risk to the social housing assets to ensure that this is appropriate and proportionate to the activities and the return that you're going to be generating. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. The regulatory position is fairly close to the charity law position for registered providers. Many registered providers are charities and therefore are subject to a higher expectation in how they behave and how they use their assets than non-charities. But the regulator has stated that it's actually quite attracted to the idea of making the charity law standard, the standard that applies across the sector to all RPs, whether they're charities or not. So very quickly, registered providers that are charities can do one of three things, or any of three things. They can do primary purpose activities which deliver their objects, which are principally the provision of social housing, but actually in most cases far wider than this, and really go to the social mission that they have to support their communities and service users and the most vulnerable in society. Obviously, if they are charities, any activities that they deliver that are falling under this heading have to meet a charitable need. The second type of activity that registered providers that are charities can carry out is investment activities, and this is effectively using the assets of the organisation that they don't need to deliver their primary purpose activities in such a way that they generate an appropriate financial return that's balanced against the risks involved. This can be asset-based, and we're increasingly seeing registered providers looking at diversifying into market rent activities and commercial properties, which is an established route for generating income, not without risk, and subject of probably a completely separate webinar in its own right. But once you knock out the primary purpose activities and the investment activities, really anything else that you're left with is a naked trading activity, generally designed to generate profits for the RP. And what charity law says, and what the regulator is expecting increasingly, is that RPs shouldn't carry out those activities where they present a significant financial risk to the organisation or to its assets. And the second thing about trading is that trading profits generally give rise to tax implications, which it's fairly difficult to mitigate, especially if you're a charity. And so if we move on to the next slide, looking at all of this together and saying how do we use this as a jumping off platform for managing the risk of commercial and diversified activities, where an RP itself shouldn't be carrying out an activity in question because it's too risky, because it's blatantly commercial. There are two principal ways that you look at delivering those activities in a safer environment, and the first is looking at whether you deliver it outside the RP itself, so through a subsidiary company. This is the traditional method of ring-fencing risk, but actually to think that it is the only way that you ring-fence risk is fairly naive, because when you're looking at setting up subsidiary companies, they do have various needs, and one of those needs is generally funding. So the RP will almost inevitably be providing some kind of financial support to the subsidiary, and therefore there is some commitment on the RP's part and some commitment of its assets towards supporting the subsidiary. Funders is also an issue, because most RPs that are still funded by traditional borrowing arrangements will need the consent of their lenders to set up subsidiary arrangements. This is easier to come by than it has been in previous years, but it still comes at a cost that needs to be factored into the business plan. There are procurement implications with shifting activities around the group, and where you're looking at providing those activities and services to both an internal and an external customer base, you need to be fairly careful to make sure that you don't inadvertently end up in a situation where the RP has to go through an EU procurement process in order to buy services from its subsidiary. And of course, governance is critically important within a group structure. The starting principle basically is that subsidiaries should be slaves to their parent, which means that they should follow the group business plan and they should follow the direction of the parent. But that is different to the parent actually micromanaging what the subsidiary does. And you need to recognise that in a commercial environment, the subsidiary is going to need the freedom to act commercially. And therefore, there has to be an understanding on the part of the parent board that this requires a different mindset to the way that the parent board probably administers the core social housing activities. So using subsidiaries to house activities that the RP shouldn't be carrying out itself is a sensible precaution to take. It's not perfect, and it does require careful planning. But the other major way that organisations are now looking to outsource risks is to put them off balance sheet by carrying them out outside the group structure altogether. We see this in the form of joint venture arrangements and cost-sharing arrangements, which are becoming increasingly popular. The thing to note about this really goes back to what both of the previous speakers have said, which is you look at risk and reward and you look at the balance between the two. If you are trying to outsource the risk to a third party, such as a development partner or joint venture partner, generally speaking, they will expect to see that recognised in the reward that they get for taking that risk on. And in that case, the return to the RP itself might be compromised. So that's an important thing to think about when looking at joint venture arrangements. Off-balance sheet is something that is very trendy at the moment. But I think, as Matthew said, you need to look at this over the course of potentially a 40-year business plan. And as we know, the rules and regulations around on and off-balance sheet transactions can change and actually are changing. So really the starting point is to say, if at any point this had to come on balance sheet, what would the implications be to the organisation? And does that influence whether or not you would want to get into this arrangement in the first place? So we're looking at joint venture arrangements, particularly in relation to cost-sharing groups across the sector, because there can be tremendous benefits from these in relation to providing services to other registered providers and not-for-profit bodies, and avoiding the need to go through a full ODU process in order to procure those services from other organisations. So there's a lot of mileage left in that. Can we have the next slide, please? So when we're looking at advising clients on structuring their diversified activities, the starting point really is to get under the skin of what it is that's being proposed and being realistic about the challenges involved. So questions to ask really are, what is your motivation in getting into this activity? Is it an offshoot of your core purpose? Is it an investment or income generation activity where the return is the principal reason for getting into it? Or is it perhaps opportunistic or responsive to external stimuli, so for example, responsive to opportunities that arise in relation to local businesses or local communities? The second question really is, what is your market here? The easiest market to tap is obviously selling existing products and services that you can already provide to new customers, or possibly selling slightly new products and services to existing customers. But obviously the most challenging environment is new products and services to new customers, and that often requires a much heavier initial investment and ongoing monitoring, particularly where the board isn't used to dealing with those kind of activities. The next question is, what are the resourcing requirements for embarking on this area? And these fall into four basic areas. So you've got the financial resourcing requirements, what cash is going to be required up front. You've got staffing requirements as well, and simply turning staff who aren't fully deployed in their normal activities to delivering commercial and diversified activities sometimes can be a risk in itself. You look at the assets that are required by the new entity or by the new business stream, and whether you have those assets already and whether it's possible to shift them around the group so that they can be used properly. And you look at the time commitment as well, because obviously the opportunity cost arising out of pursuing commercial activities needs to be factored in. And then just thinking about what the major challenges are and anticipating how you'll be planning for these in the business plan. First of all, the commercial mindset, because commercial and diversified activities really generally require a commercial and diversified mindset, which can be quite different to the mindset for delivering your core social housing activities. You'll need to look at the flexibility of your existing corporate structure and work out whether or not you need to make any changes to it in order to deliver the activities in a risk-free way. And looking at your governance arrangements is particularly important, because whichever board oversees these activities, whichever is the parent board, needs to be strong enough and experienced enough to manage these in an appropriate way that doesn't compromise the ability of the group to capitalise on its commercial opportunities, but at the same time manages the risk of doing so. So if we could have the next slide, please. Planning for success as well as failure, and this really goes back to what Matthew was saying about stress testing the business plan to ensure it can withstand all of the rocks that could be thrown at it over a 30 or 40-year period. It's important to plan for success as well as failure, because quite often if you have an immensely successful commercial enterprise, you need to find some way of ensuring that it doesn't destabilise the rest of the group and be a victim of your own success, really. So first of all, identify how you would measure success and how you would measure failure. What are your objectives for these activities? And what are the key indicators for that? So, for example, a measure of failure might be 2 years of financial performance below certain levels, or possibly the loss of a significant contract. And working out at what point you need to start thinking about whether you can continue with those activities. You need to look at the risks of both failure and success, and as I've said, success brings its own challenges. And finally, you need to have an exit plan, so working out what you do when you have achieved your definition of success, or when the enterprise has perhaps failed, and how you extricate yourself in a way that doesn't jeopardise the social housing assets and the social housing activities. So finally, if we move on to the last slide, I would say that the hallmarks for a successful startup of commercial and diversified activities are, first of all, that the executive team really has to own it as a concept. And secondly, you need that to dovetail with the board, and the board needs to be engaged, informed and supportive of the venture, and they have to have a comprehensive understanding of the risks that are involved. You need to make sure that you have, obviously, your external advice in the form of legal advice, tax advice, accounting advice, and also professional and commercial advice where you require it. And your corporate structure needs to be aligned to enable you to deliver the activity while managing the risks as much as possible. You need to identify your key resources are and ensure that those are deployed appropriately within your organisation. And you need to have a robust plan for implementing it so it doesn't just drag on. You need to do your contingency planning so that you know at what point you need to start thinking about whether you pull out of an activity. And you need to have rigorous and risk-focused ongoing monitoring, including an appropriate way of dovetailing that with what the parent board is looking at. And finally, you need to agree what your exit strategy is before you get into it. And I hope that was about 7 minutes, Stuart. May have gone slightly over.
A wee bit over, Victoria, but I didn't want to stop because it was all very interesting stuff. Thank you very much for that. Okay, fine. We've got 15 minutes or so for questions and discussion. Obviously, there's been loads coming through from everybody who's attending the webinar, so thank you very much for that. I just want to kick things off actually by asking a question of Afzal. One of the things I'm just wondering about, the clear thing here, is in terms of the opportunities that Service Matters has pursued. I mean, can you just say, just very briefly, what you have pursued in terms of the areas that you've worked in, and how you decided to choose those areas?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. In terms of Service Matters, the services that we are actively selling, as it were, are wide-ranging, but the core ones are around procurement, our contact center, if you like, internal audit, and business improvement, because we have lean experts within the business. And the reason we have developed those for selling is simply that those are the areas that we're being asked to provide by certainly the housing sector. So we've developed them, and also those seem to be the areas around the word commercial, because all of them will identify improvements, will identify efficiencies for organizations, and will provide them with food for thought around innovation. So, we developed them particularly around customer demand.
Okay, right, fine. So there weren't areas, that's what I'm getting at here. Were there particular areas where you did try to explore, but you then decided against?
No. The areas that we pursued in terms of selling to other organizations, relatively successful in all of those areas, and we found that other organizations were willing and wanting to buy that expertise from Service Matters. And the other one, I should say, is information governance, and that's a very topical subject not only in this sector.
So what would you say, just picking up on the risk point that all the panelists referred to, and I'll come to others on this in a second if that's all right, but I mean, what would you say is the appetite for risk that Orbit has with regard to Service Matters? I mean, is it quite, to what extent do you feel as though you are pushing yourselves, or are you operating relatively cautiously?
Well, I think the Orbit has a well-considered appetite for risk in this particular area. In terms of our ambition to 2020, we have set ourselves quite a big target in terms of turnover and also, therefore, net profit. Orbit primarily sees...
You currently turn over about £1 million, don't you? So you're seeking to double that by 2020, or?
In the region of £4 million. By 2020.
4 million by 2020. Wow, right, okay. And that's just doing the same activities you're doing now?
It is primarily doing the same activities, but also adding on 2 or 3 products in the next few years. I think along the lines of what Victoria was saying about thinking about your market, and we think that the market will want an additional 2 or 3 products that we're currently thinking of and are in the pipeline. We already provide those internally within Orbit, and primarily for Orbit. The reason Orbit has this appetite for risk in this particular area, albeit calculated risk, it's because it drives that commercial mindset, it drives that commercial thinking. So what Orbit gets in return are smart and excellent services within the Orbit group. So we become that much sharper, our teams become that much sharper using that commercial approach. And so the services that we provide internally continue to evolve and continue to get better because Orbit has its own ambitions in terms of customer service. So again, this activity helps drive that.
Okay, thank you for that, Afzal. Matthew, I mean, you hear Afzal saying there, obviously, they've taken a relatively cautious approach to what they've done here to try to diversify their income streams, but obviously talking about quite aggressive expansion there. I mean, how do you feel about that in terms of the HCA in principle? Because organisations are looking to try to do this. I'm just wondering, I mean, is there a point at which you would say to an organisation, listen, that's probably as far as we're comfortable with you going, or so long as the board is saying we are cognizant of the risks here and we're comfortable with the level of risk that we're taking on as an organisation, do you leave them to get on with it?
Well, I think we'd look at it in terms of compliance with our standards, and obviously we're looking at those standards now, and we may reconfigure them at the margin at least. There is a point, I think, where an organisation is taking on so much risk, and that risk comes back, to potentially have recourse to the social housing assets, where we would say that, the strategy is not in line with our standards, and we'd take, appropriate action if we needed to. I think just picking up on, the example that was given, I would draw quite a sharp distinction between diversification of revenue-based activities, which is basically what Orbit have been talking about, and diversification into activities which entail taking on very long-term liabilities. So, long-term debt associated with, let's say, student housing, which relies on the performance of an asset class over a period of maybe 20, 30 years, is rather different to going into, let's say, a care business or diversifying from corporate services, where, if it goes wrong, basically, the exit strategy is to employ fewer people. Now, that will cost money, but it doesn't have quite the same risk profile as something where you've got debt that you need to service for a long period of time.
Okay, there are a few questions coming through from the audience about issues around the private rented sector, Matthew. Obviously, you'll be aware that's a key area into which a number of social landlords are expanding. Obviously, that's out with the remit of Service Matters, but Orbit Group as a wider organisation is clearly looking at this area too. But I'm just wondering, I mean, you talked about this issue around housing providers not adequately pricing risk. I'm just wondering, to what extent within the private rented sector does that give you concern, or are you confident that providers are approaching this in the correct way?
Well, I don't think there's one answer to that. It will depend on the providers and the markets they're operating in, and the structure of any debt that's associated with, and with the moving into the private rented sector and so on. So, yeah, the simple point I think is, well, firstly, I'd encourage any provider looking at this to take the advice from someone like Victoria about how to structure it. I mean, there clearly are varies issues, charitable providers, but there are broader questions about how best to structure the business, the sort of issues around governance that Victoria raised and so on. I think the PRS is different. I noticed one of the questions pointed out that social housing is moving on as well, and the extent to which housing benefit underwrites the rental income risk is changed. That's right, I think. So there's a risk there as well. But I mean, typically, in terms of the PRS, you're more exposed to changes in the market than you would be in social housing. Insofar as housing benefit is relevant, then you're exposed to a different regime, local housing allowance. It may be that the strategy is to keep the assets for a while and then dispose of them on the open market. That means you're exposed to house price inflation. So it is qualitatively different, I think, to social housing. It doesn't mean that providers shouldn't do it, but as Victoria said, it needs to be properly thought through. From our perspective, the bottom line is, if it goes wrong, will the social housing business be able to withstand that shock? And we'd expect providers to think that through very carefully and come to an appropriate answer.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Victoria, I'm just wondering, in your experience, I mean, to what extent, when providers come to you with ideas about how they could diversify their income streams, I mean, to what extent do you feel, and I'm suggesting you name names here, but I mean, are they generally getting the pricing of the risk correct in the ventures they're undertaking, or do you find that you're having to do a degree of education around what people maybe should or shouldn't be thinking about?
It's a really interesting question, because obviously RPs come in many, many different flavours, and therefore what they're planning to do is vastly influenced by where the needs are in their communities and also what their strengths are. I think it's fairly rare in my experience for an RP to come to me and ask for advice about something that is really out of kilter with what they already do. And I think most organisations are starting by looking at what they are good at doing at the moment in relation to their own stock and their own communities, and whether they have the opportunity to offer that to others as well. And that is always the easiest place to start from, really. That said, a lot of organisations have been expressing considerable interest in the private rented sector, and as everybody has said, you know, that carries an extra special health warning, really. It's definitely something that RPs can get into, and arguably in some cases should get into, because the demographics of the people that they serve are changing and the housing need is changing. But really looking at it either as a commercial activity purely or as a non-commercial activity purely isn't helpful, because there are shades of grey there. I think in the main organisations are approaching diversification, when you attach the C word, the commercial word to it, fairly carefully and very sensibly, really. But I think it'll be interesting to see how many cost-sharing groups flood the market in the next few years, and how we move beyond RPs simply looking to expand on what they do already into brand new markets.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Victoria. I'm just wondering also, I mean, there was you mentioned the point around lender consent for what people are trying to do. I mean, to what extent do you find that lenders are up for allowing providers to make opportunities happen, or are they to a certain degree stymieing that?
If it's really a question about to what extent lenders are still holding the whip hand here, the answer is in most cases they do generally control what RPs can and can't do. They either do that through business plan approvals, or they do that through restrictions on creating subsidiaries and on lending. So I think lenders are very, very cautious about RPs diversifying outside their core areas, and we have seen that put the brakes on quite a few initiatives that might have otherwise gone ahead. That said, I don't necessarily think funders are in the wrong by being cautious about it, because in some cases the funders really are the only external body that has the commercial experience and which is really, really scrutinising the financials on it. I think also funders are thinking, well, why should the money that we've lent at very nice cheap rates for social housing purposes be used for commercial activities, and why can't we get a return on that? So I think what we'll see in the future is we'll see that there is a balance to be struck between funders allowing these activities, but on the basis that they're funded separately by separate facilities at more commercial rates.
I'm just wondering also, I mean, in terms of the approach towards particular ventures. I mean, given what happened with Cosmopolitan, I mean, are there certain markets that landlords should avoid trying to expand into? I mean, is student housing just something that's not worth raising as a potential venture, or is that something that perhaps there would still be an appetite for?
I think it comes down to the motivation for getting into the activity in question. I'm fairly, I wouldn't say concerned, but I'm fairly aware of the fact that a lot of RPs are looking at things like student accommodation as money-making ventures without appreciating that actually, you know, those kind of enterprises are more vulnerable to market sways than social housing. So, you know, I think that RPs can and should look at those kind of markets, but not necessarily, but recognising, I suppose, that there is an enormous geographical bias towards those models working in some areas of the countries and not others. And also looking at the way that, for example, education is going to be expanding in the future, and the propensity for students to be living at home. So there are lots of things that influence whether or not RPs should be doing those kind of activities. And it's just that there needs to be a cold towel look at these activities before RPs dip their toe in.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. I'm just wondering, just coming back to Julian, perhaps, I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of, and there's a question that came through from Craig Glasper, actually wondering about, you know, what the activity, what the revenue from, or the profit from Service Matters has allowed Orbit to do that otherwise might not have been able to do. I mean, what sort of things has the organisation done as a direct result of Service Matters, you know, business venture?
I mean, that's a great question, and actually I'm answering a couple of questions on there about, you know, understanding your overheads, because actually until you really understand your overheads, actually identifying what that genuine surplus is very important. I think sort of two reflections on there is one, actually the profit has enabled us, and the scale of the service means that we can have those senior managers, we can have a breadth of service of actually the service that internal audit provide internally and procurement is much sharper, much more focused, because it's having to serve those external customers. So the frontline manager, the actual housing association part of it has got a better service because of it, and therefore more efficient and effective. One of the things we want to do actually this year is actually to say, right, you know, make this sort of more visual, is to say, well, how many houses effectively can service how matters build with its profit, and that's something we haven't nailed as a sort of an image yet, but that's something we're really going to focus on, because somebody else mentioned about motivation and how do we do this, and if we're driving this profit per purpose, and if people could say, well, actually by doing this we've helped to build 4 houses, 5 houses, 10 houses, whatever it is, that's a great motivator for those in those sectors. So very much work in progress at the moment, but on the right direction.
And what, I mean, in terms of I suppose there's a question came on here from Neil Bancroft as well about the alternative to I suppose exploring using surpluses. That's what the idea is, using surpluses of organisations in a different way, and perhaps looking to try and generate you know, revenues through investing in local communities. I mean, is that the sort of thing that Orbit is looked at, or is it the case that, you know, that sort of activity would complement what Service Matters does?
Yeah, I think what we're looking to do is you know, show how we can. You know, Orbit has some great ambitions for 2020. You know, it wants to, you know, put 12,000 brand new homes into the ground by 2020 through a variety of different mechanisms. We want to bring in 10,000 sort of training places in, you know, that don't normally exist out there in terms of our community activities. So, you know, Service Matters can make that direct competition and a great contribution through a financial sense, but also in terms of the innovation we bring in to say, well, actually, to do that, we've got to act and think differently as a business. We've got to think more efficiently and effectively. So that is very much Orbit's mantra is about building communities, and that really binds us to what we're trying to do, and it's showing our direct contribution to those areas.
Yeah, well, just a quick last thing, Julian, actually. I'm just wondering, I mean, you talked about the extent, obviously, your experience working in the private sector, but to what extent do you think it's necessary for providers who are looking to expand their services, diversify, to sell aspects of the service they provide, to what extent is it necessary for them to have experience of operating within the private sector to be able to properly evaluate opportunities they're pursuing?
I think having that personal experience is you know, should not be undervalued. I went out and worked for a small business for 6 years, selling professional services, and to be honest, you know, money and cash flow and those were very real to me on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes in a larger organisation, those things aren't as real, and that sort of day-to-day necessity and understanding which you get in that is important. I think also it's you know, if you know it is possible and you know how to do it or know how not to do it, there's that real experience to bring in, rather than saying, well, if we do it this way, copy somebody else. But if you're that direct, I think it's invaluable. And all of our senior management team and within Service Matters have all got that commercial experience, although now wedded to the housing sector. We've all got that kind of faith that it can work and how to do it.
Okay, that's Julian. That's great. Thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time. We have ticked just past 1 o'clock, so I'm conscious there are other questions we've not quite had a chance to pick up on. Apologies for that. But the webinar, obviously we've recorded it. It will be available on our website for people to download it and listen to again at their leisure. Also, once the webinar finishes, as I said at the outset, you will be offered the option to download the presentation and also the Q&A box, which obviously we've all been using. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to our panel today for making this such a really excellent discussion, and best of luck to all organisations who've attended in terms of your own ventures. Thank you all very much, and the webinar is now going to come to an end. Thank you.